What if I told you that some of the most sophisticated education systems in human history left behind no textbooks, no stone universities, no diplomas, and yet shaped civilizations? Before printing presses and parchment, before lecture halls and libraries, the peoples of ancient America developed dynamic, deeply effective systems of knowledge transmission. These were not crude oral tales passed around fires. They were curricula, delivered with precision and ceremony, structured across generations, encoded in chants, stone alignments, animal movements, and sacred dances. From the Andean highlands to the Great Lakes, from Mesoamerican temples to Arctic ice villages, education thrived. And at the center of this intellectual world were what we might now call oral universities, places and processes where wisdom was passed down, not by paper, but by memory and living experience. In this episode of Untold Secrets of Ancient America, we uncover the teaching traditions, memory systems, knowledge keepers, and spiritual scholars that shaped the ancient mindscape of the Americas. When you think of a university, what comes to mind? Stone buildings, academic robes, textbooks, lectures, grades. But let's strip that down to its essence. A university is a system of preserving, structuring, and transmitting advanced knowledge. And in that sense, the ancient Americas were filled with universities, just not ones we would recognize at first glance. They had faculty, elders, shamans, astronomers, storytellers, artisans. They had admission requirements, years of initiation, trials of memory, spiritual purification. They had degrees, knowledge that deepened in layers, often with symbolic garments or items bestowed upon the learner at each stage. Some students spent decades memorizing genealogies, medicinal formulas, migration routes, mythological systems, astronomical cycles, and legal frameworks, all without writing a single word. Their classrooms were caves, kivas, mountaintops, and dance circles. The medium of transmission was the living human voice, often ritualized and communal, and the stakes, civilization itself. The knowledge preserved in these oral universities was essential for agriculture, politics, healing, timekeeping, diplomacy, and survival. One of the most astonishing aspects of these education systems was the use of mnemonic devices, methods of memory encoding that made it possible to store and recall thousands of data points. The Inca quipus, those bundles of knotted strings, are perhaps the most famous example. Recent research suggests they weren't just numerical tools, but carried syllabic or symbolic meanings, effectively becoming a non-written script for memory. But quipus were just one of many tools. The Ojibwe Midewiwin Society used birchbark scrolls, incised with pictographic symbols that served as cues for reciting complex spiritual and medical teachings. The Lakota created winter counts, pictorial calendars that served as teaching aids for tribal historians. Puebloan storytellers used sand paintings and painted pottery as symbolic maps for ceremonial knowledge. And everywhere, stories themselves were designed as memory tools, filled with metaphor, rhythm, repetition, sacred numbers, and symbolic imagery. Knowledge was embedded in dance, in carving, in weaving. A woman weaving a sacred pattern wasn't just making a blanket, she was encoding myth, math, and cosmology. In many traditions, knowledge wasn't taught in the modern sense. It was earned. A young person might begin their education with a single story, told and retold by an elder. Over the years, that story would be revealed to have multiple layers: myth, history, astronomy, lore. The student would be required to memorize and recite it exactly, often before a council or in ceremony. In the Andes, young apprentices were chosen to become amautas, elite teachers and philosophers of Inca society. They spent years in training, learning astronomy, ethics, agriculture, engineering, and religious codes, delivered orally by masters. Among the Maya, scribes and calendar priests were trained in sacred almanacs and ceremonial cycles, often passed down through family lineages. In North America, young warriors were mentored not just in combat, but in rhetoric, ethics, diplomacy, and spiritual cosmology. Among the Zuni, Hopi, and Pueblo peoples, initiation into the Kiva systems meant participating in an entire ceremonial calendar, each rite teaching moral lessons, astronomical alignments, and social structure. It was a holistic education: mind, body, spirit. Not all knowledge was public. Many indigenous societies maintained hierarchical or compartmentalized systems of instruction, where sacred or dangerous information was only given to initiates. The Midewiwin Society of the Great Lakes is a perfect example. Students would pass through up to 8 levels of instruction, each requiring memorization of songs, chants, medical teachings, and ethical principles. Instruction was delivered through drum, chant, symbolic diagrams, and dramatic performance. Among the Aztecs, 2 major schools existed: the Telpochcali for commoner boys and the Calmecac for the elite, where students learned ethics, history, and religion through rote memorization and ritual practice. In the Andes, there were classes of women, aclas, selected for their beauty and intelligence to be trained in weaving, poetry, ritual preparation, and religious diplomacy. These institutions were selective, disciplined, and revered. Some teachings were never spoken aloud, only danced, sung, or visualized. Knowledge was alive, and its power was respected. Let's shift our gaze upward. Astronomy was one of the crown jewels of oral education in ancient America. The Maya, of course, developed one of the most advanced astronomical systems in the world. But what's often overlooked is that much of this was oral. Priest astronomers, or arkin, memorized tables of eclipses, solstices, Venus cycles, and sacred dates, all encoded in poetic verse and ritual drama. In the American Southwest, the Chacon peoples constructed entire city alignments based on lunar standstills, events that only repeat every 18.6 years. Imagine the memory discipline required to track that across generations without telescopes or books. In the Arctic, Inuit navigators memorize star positions to guide sled routes in pitch-black winters. In North America, star knowledge was passed through story: the Lakota falling star, the Navajo constellations used in healing ceremonies, the Pawnee Skidi star charts for planting. Education here wasn't isolated from spirituality, it was spiritual. Learning the stars meant learning your place in the cosmos. Among the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Great Law of Peace formed the foundation of one of the oldest constitutional democracies on Earth. And it was entirely oral. Students, often future chiefs, would memorize dozens of symbolic wampum belts, each representing a historical treaty, moral law, or political principle. Young speakers would train for years to recite condolence speeches, metaphorical language, and deliberation protocols used in councils. Law wasn't learned from books. It was spoken, debated, and dramatized. In Mesoamerica, Aztec orators were trained in Huehuetlahtoli, the speech of the elders, a tradition of formal wisdom used in law and ethics. In the Pacific Northwest, treaty-making was preceded by oral performances, kinship recitations, and public memory reviews. These were not informal practices. They were as rigorous as modern law schools and far more communal. Contrary to stereotype, women were often central figures in education. In many matrilineal cultures, women held and passed the oral genealogies, land claims, and ceremonial calendars. Among the Iroquois, clan mothers selected and guided chiefs, often training younger women in political discernment. Among the Nahua Aztecs, noble women were trained in poetics, medicine, ritual etiquette, and midwifery. Among the Navajo, women learned complex weaving patterns that were cosmological maps. Some Plains tribes held women-only ceremonies that transmitted dream songs, healing rites, and survival strategies. Education wasn't just about survival, it was about cultural continuity, and women were often its fiercest guardians. When European colonizers arrived, they didn't just destroy cities, they targeted memory. Sacred fires were extinguished, elder councils were dissolved, children were taken to residential schools, languages were banned, songs forbidden. In many cases, the entire oral university of a people, their history, science, ethics, spiritual law, was contained in a handful of elders. And when those elders died without transmitting their teachings, entire civilizations of memory vanished. It was an intellectual genocide, one we're still reckoning with today. And yet, not all was lost. Across the Americas, indigenous peoples are reclaiming their memory systems. Language revitalization projects, ceremonial schools, cultural apprenticeships, digital winter counts, elder storytelling archives. All of it is part of a resurgence. Because the oral universities were never about buildings, they were about people, and people endure. Perhaps in a world obsessed with speed and data, it's time to re-listen to those who trained their minds to remember the stars, who taught their children with symbols in the sand, who spoke the world into order with nothing but breath and rhythm. The ancients are still speaking. The question is, are we listening?